Why do we need so much regulation? Would we not be better off if banks were allowed to fail? If you had competition, if banks were competing for deposits and the competition wasn't about interest rates so much, but about sound management and a track record, wouldn't that be a better way of making sure that banks behave themselves? I mean, if people thought that a bank could fail, they would think twice about where they stick their savings. And I personally think that banks should have been allowed to fail in the GFC. And I think it was a big moral, there is the moral hazard, obviously. But if more banks had been allowed to fail, then maybe, maybe we wouldn't have had the crazy lending and all that. You would say, obviously, consumers need protection and all that sort of stuff, which is a counter argument. But why not have less regulation and allow failures and then it will become part of our culture that banks can fail?
Nick, you're quite right in that this is a very controversial issue. In fact, it occupies a lot of academics' time in our research. And what I can say to you is that I think it's dangerous to go to one extreme or the other. Obviously, over-regulation affects efficiency, market efficiency, and profitability of banks. We want banks to survive. We want banks to strive because they're an essential component of any economy. On the other hand, there's what we call the public interest. Mums and dads aren't equipped to understand and analyse financial statements of complex organisations. It's hard to find an organisation more complex than a bank, with all the various divisions, with all the various business operations, including from treasury, dealing, derivatives and so forth, corporate lending and so on. So given that inability to understand the risks that they're confronted with when they deposit their hard-earned savings into a bank, protection of that consumer is vital. The last thing a politician wants is for a consumer to go bankrupt, given that there was a lack of regulation over the banks which they rely upon. So politics comes into play as well.
I guess a corollary of if you're going to guarantee deposits, well then just a world of regulation comes with it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and guaranteeing deposits is dangerous. We did that immediately after the GFC, but that was a temporary measure.
Well, it saved. Look, I don't want to name names, but there are certain banks that it saved.
That's right.
And there was one bank in particular. I remember on the Saturday mornings on the sideline watching the kids play sport. There was one guy, and he was very senior in one of these banks, and he was, they were just gone. He kept saying every weekend, "We're gone, we're gone, we're gone." They got the bank guarantee, and then they went on the warpath, acquiring all of these other financial institutions and assets, loan books and what have you, because all of a sudden they were able to raise the capital. And there were these other little institutions that weren't guaranteed, they weren't part of the banking system. They couldn't raise capital. They had runs on them. I remember there was one called Bidgie Finance. So then because of that intervention, there was a distortion, if you like, because these other finance companies should have survived, really. There shouldn't have been a run on them. But because the banks were being guaranteed and some,
not only does it create an unlevel playing field and a disproportionality in the market between ADIs and non-ADIs, it also creates what you alluded to earlier, which is moral hazard. If a bank CEO knows that the deposits are guaranteed, that all his funding is guaranteed, that creates an environment whereby the CEO may make riskier decisions knowing that he or she will be bailed out. That moral hazard is very dangerous. That's why
all care and no responsibility.
That's right. That's why the government guarantees over our deposits in the early period post GFC was temporary and gradually wound down. That was effective and often cited as one of the key components that allowed Australia to avoid one of the few countries to avoid a recession.